Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be the sort of academic in the room and use a few slides, with your permission. Um, so my remarks here draw upon a broad array of work with a number of collaborators, mostly economists, also biostatisticians and policymakers in a group called the Accelerating Health Technologies team. We partnered together starting early in the pandemic in the when the pandemic hit the United States to start thinking about a number of questions, especially around vaccine innovation and production and distribution and allocation. Most of what I'm going to say today is captured in two of our prior papers, one in Science and one in the AEA Papers and Proceedings. First, let me sort of start with the punchline, or punchlines plural. We found that the economic costs of the pandemic are truly staggering, on the order of tens of trillions of dollars, in the first year. And as a result, there is a truly tremendous return to preparedness and to fast response in the event of a pandemic. That requires upfront investments in technology and production capacity, both nationally and globally. Additionally, and towards the supply chain and trade questions we're talking about today, the supply chain for vaccine production is inherently and unavoidably, global. There's no way to make it not so. And as a result, and very in concert with the remarks previously in this session, this necessitates real international collaboration and coordinated response, especially with US allies. And then in particular, towards ensuring that the correct investments are taken up front, and also to ensure that we can make a robust and quick response in the event of a pandemic or other, sort of major public health emergency, we need strong commitments to information and resource sharing. This is essential both up front, and I'll detail this a little bit more, to ensuring the correct incentives to build production capacity and invest in technology for vaccines and other public health measures, and also for us to be able to scale up production quickly and make sure that we and everyone else has access to the resources they need. So first, just to set the sense of scale, so Operation Warp Speed was, sort of in the tens of billions of dollars. The IMF recently released an estimate for vaccinating 40% of the world population by end of this year and 60% by middle of next year at order of 50 billion. And these sound like really huge numbers, but the human and economic costs of the pandemic are orders of magnitude higher. So my collaborators and I, used sort of a number of different estimates of the health and economic costs and came up with numbers in the tens of trillions. So the value of vaccine capacity, sort of 3 billion courses per year, effective as of last year, would have been, approximately $17 trillion. And this is a measurement that accounts for sort of measurable economic losses and health losses, but not, sort of unhappiness, lots of other things that occur in the pandemic. It's actually, believe it or not, it's a conservative number. And that means that the value of additional capacity to produce vaccines and other, sort of in other parts of the public health response is also tremendous. So, we estimated that if we had been able to bring on an additional billion doses of capacity per year, effective April 2021, that would have been worth about $1 trillion in welfare. And even if we'd only, sort of at the state we were in July, if we were able to bring on another billion courses per year, that still would have been worth $250 billion. And so compared to the numbers we've actually been spending, that's, sort of where there's tremendous opportunity to invest more. The other thing that's essential, and this applies to sort of any type of public health investment, but especially when there's a lot of uncertainty about which technology is going to be useful and how much need you will have, we need upfront supply and capacity commitments. You need what we call push funding rather than pull funding. This is especially true in vaccine markets because market prices are the prices of the vaccines are typically held below market rates. Not by competition as in the case of generic drugs, but rather by sort of political agreements and support. And this disincentivizes firms from producing the optimal level of capacity. So you actually need direct government investments in capacity. That has a bunch of benefits in the short term, right? It speeds up vaccination, which saves lives and mitigates economic damage, but it also leads to lower prices in the long run. Towards the supply chain, vaccines rely on a truly global supply chain with a number of different inputs produced all over the world. there are some very unusual ones. LAL is used to sort of test for endotoxins, and it's found in horseshoe crab blood. The only natural occurrence, rather, is in horseshoe crab blood. We now have a synthetic, but the synthetic, sort of was a relatively new innovation and had not gone through all of its sort of regulatory process at the start of the pandemic. So we need like a regulatory framework to make these sorts of substitute and efficient production inputs available. But we also need international collaboration. So we talked with some producers who explained that the types of medical grade bioreactors that were being used were only available, like the only manufacturer of these bioreactors was in Germany. And the process for constructing them was took a very long time. And so, you really needed to be able to buy them up front, and you needed to ensure an agreement or commitment that they could be exported. So what do you need for this supply chain to work? You need commitments to free export. Again, that's to ensure access in the times of need, and it's to incentivize you to take those upfront investments in capacity that are needed to make sure that you're ready in the case of an emergency. You need international market infrastructure, both to ensure that the inputs are not wasted, right? To the extent that there were just fundamental bottlenecks in production, not enough horseshoe crabs and such. You need to make sure that every unit you have is not wasted. And CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, as part of COVAX, organized a centralized marketplace whereby excess ingredients could be traded among companies in a way to make sure that we don't exhaust supply. This also has the effect of disincentivizing hoarding, right? So if you can guarantee that you can get what you need, then you have less incentive to hoard for yourself, which actually means that everyone has more access, right? If there's less hoarding, then the supply chain functions more efficiently in the first place. And then, as I mentioned, we need, investment and regulatory frameworks, in times, in peacetime, as it were, for supporting scale up at the time of an emergency. And that's like investment in synthetics, high yield production, sort of new R&D to make the inputs in the supply chain more accessible. And that goes to the resilience question. So in closing, sort of a variation of the points we started with, pandemics are global. They require coordinated global response, and also, responding to them requires global cooperation on supply chain and production. And its speed is really important, right? There were costs of information delays in our learning about the pandemic from China. And that allowed the pandemic to spread much more broadly and slowed down our response in terms of preparing vaccines and understanding other public health measures to institute. And then similarly, like even small, delays, like there was a couple of weeks delay in our providing certain inputs to India during the Delta wave in India, have tremendous human and economic costs, both, sort of immediately and downstream, right? Our inability to get the Delta variant under control has continued to cascade into economic and human costs in the United States and around the world. It's impossible to know what would have happened had we been able to help India, move their vaccination program ahead faster. But certainly we would have mitigated some of those costs and also, decreased the extent of the incidents today. And then lastly, and let me emphasize once more that international commitments are essential for enabling countries to make the optimal investments, right? Without a commitment to be able to, that enables companies inside of countries to be certain that they can get the inputs they need, there's incentive to underinvest, and there's incentive to invest in the wrong portfolios because, you're sort of tied to just what you are certain you can get in the event of an emergency. Right, so you're going to underinvest in production capacity. You might, sort of choose to invest in the wrong, vaccines or the wrong technologies if you're concerned about supply chain disruption in a time of need. And especially given that these types of pandemic investments really need to be made up front, you sort of need a large push component. It's essential that we incentivize the optimal investments.